until recently, Israel never acknowledged the strikes it carried out against Iran's positions within Syria. Now it has done so. Now, it did so partly because on April 9th, after Israel struck at what was the T4 base in central Syria, it was the Russians who exposed or outed Israel. And once they did, Israel, which doesn't normally acknowledge that they carried out these strikes, they don't do it because they don't want to put Iran in a position where it has no choice but to respond, or otherwise it loses face. On April 9th, the Russians outed the Israelis, partly because I think when the Israelis carried out that strike, it was at a base where the Russians are co-located. The Russians weren't forewarned, and this, even though the strike was quite precise, the Russians didn't like that, and therefore they outed it. I think there was a second reason they outed it. Putin wants to look as if it's Russia who's the arbiter of events and not the US. This was 2 days after the Syrians, after the Assad regime had carried out the chemical weapons strike on Duma, and I don't think, I think that Putin wanted it clear that this was Israel who did it, not the United States. When the US subsequently did retaliate, it was a very limited retaliation. It was a retaliation that, in effect, was designed to ensure that we didn't hit close to the Russians or the Iranians, and in effect further cemented this idea that the Trump administration is determined to get out of Syria, not to be drawn more into it. The American policy right now in Syria is very clearly about ISIS, not about Iran. But Israel is put in a position where it has to act, and it has to act in a way that tries to impress the Iranians that the price for them of embedding themselves is too high, but also it has to act in a way that is designed to convince the Russians that they should do more to try to contain the Iranians within Syria. Think about the following. Prime Minister Netanyahu has visited Russia 8 times, the most recent one last week, 8 times in less than 2 years. Now, he's done that for 2 reasons. One is to try to ensure deconfliction, so a deconfliction between Israeli and Russian forces. But he's also done it trying to convince the Russians that they have to contain the spread of the Iranians in Syria. The Prime Minister has succeeded in terms of deconfliction. He's not succeeded in terms of containing, getting the Russians to do more to contain the Iranians within Syria. So this dynamic of heading on a collision course is still taking place, and Israel, in a sense, is ratcheting up what it's doing, both to try to ensure that the Iranians don't cross a certain threshold within Syria, but also to try to convince the Russians to do more to stop the spread of the Iranians.